Well, hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Help My Business is Growing, a podcast where we explore how to grow and build a business that is healthy and sustainable. I'm your host, Kathy Svetina, a fractional CFO and founder of Newcastle Finance, a company where we believe that everything that you do in your business will eventually end up in your finances. And to get to healthy finances is to have a healthy business. How do you get there? Well, this is where this podcast comes in to help. If you're running a growing business, you know that competition is tough and it's easy to just get blended, in the sea of sameness of other companies. So how do you differentiate yourself and stand out, especially when you're currently not the biggest player in the industry? And again, this is important for your finances. And one effective way is through challenger branding, a unique and powerful strategy many businesses overlook that can help them succeed in a competitive market. It can help you create a distinctive brand and set you apart from competitors, meaning that you can charge higher prices, you have better revenue options, and all that good stuff. But what is challenger branding exactly, and will it work for a small business? And how can you use your company's culture to make this approach work for you? As a quick reminder, all of the episodes on this podcast, including this one, come with timestamps for topics that we discuss, and each one has its own blog post. You can find all the links and the detailed topics in the episode show notes. My guest today is Mike Sullivan. He is a president and CEO of Loomis, the country's leading challenger brand advertising agency. For more than 30 years, he's helped some of the country's most successful companies build their brands. He is also the author of the book, The Voice of the Underdog: How Challenger Brands Create Distinction by Thinking Culture First. Join us. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're here because we're going to be talking about branding and positioning. And, for someone who deals with finances and numbers, I strangely love to talk about this a lot. And if you're listening to this, we're currently in about 60 episodes into this podcast. And if you check what was the most talked about topic, it was marketing. There's a reason for it. Because when marketing does well, it's done well, it will make a significant financial impact on the business. And it's also why I get practically hives when I hear businesses about cutting marketing spend to save costs. And I'm putting this in quotation marks. Because unless things are really not working out, this is a perfect example of being penny wise and pound foolish. But this little rant aside, Mike, you wrote a book about challenging brands, and your business is an actual example of that too. And I have so many questions about that. But first, let's dive into what is a challenger brand exactly?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to just concur with you 100% on marketing. And marketing really should be looked at as an investment, not an expense. And it should be held to those standards, in terms of marketing ROI. But challenger brands are the kind of brands that we have a real special affinity for. And so classically defined, any brand that is not the leading brand in a category is technically a challenger brand. You're challenging to become the category leader, if you were, or at least to overtake the position just ahead of you. But we think about it a little more broadly than that, because when you look at like classic challenger brands, and some of my favorite are like Uber and Airbnb, we can talk a little bit about those in a minute. If you look at them, they have really unique cultures. So the first thing is we speak about is state of market. So they're not number one. So they have sort of a culture of ambition. They're striving for something better. They want to overtake the competitor just in front of them. Then we talk about sort of the state of mind. And so challenger brands are either already the best at something, or they are striving to become the best at something for their consumers. And so we characterize that as sort of a culture of commitment. And then from my perspective, I think the very most important thing is what we call a state of readiness. And that really reduces to leadership's willingness to take on new modes of thinking, to break with category conventions and do things different, to disrupt. And that takes a lot of courage. And we call that a culture of willingness. And so those three things, when they conspire, when they come together, you get brands like Uber and Airbnb and Warby Parker, Red Bull, and just some other just wonderful challenger brands that I love talking about.
So these are all big brands, obviously, Uber, Airbnb, but how do you apply this to the small business world? Because a lot of people, what they might think is, this is all fine, but how does this really look like in the small business space? Is this even possible in the small business space? From my perspective, I would argue that, any business starts as a small business. So you have to start somewhere. But what is your take on that?
Well, no, you're 100% right. And that's very often the reaction that you get. But what people forget is that they're looking at sort of the finished product. You look at Red Bull, you go, my God, they're the biggest, beverage company in the world, following Coke, perhaps, but they're certainly the biggest energy beverage company in the world. They weren't always. They started off as this little tiny Austrian quirky beverage, and they snuck up on the category leader. One of my favorites to talk about is a brand like Chick-fil-A. Well, Truett Cathy back in the 60s, he started with one chicken shack. He didn't start with a chain of chicken stores. But what he did, and what every challenger brand leader needs to do, is he got really clear on his values. And his values are the things that informed every aspect of his behavior. They helped him create his mission, his vision, whether he articulated that clearly or not from the jump. He had a felt sense of who he was and what he wanted to put into the world. And then he was disciplined about that. And what you see today is a product of Truett's original work, getting very clear on his values. And in his case, obviously, and this is important for challenger brands too, to think about what your values are, to think about what you say yes to and what you say no to. You can't be all things to all people. That's a tragic marketing mistake that we see all the time. For example, we've got a client that's a fitness, it's a gym, a chain of gyms. They aren't the gym for everybody. They're a gym for a very specific group of people. But very often clients will say, well, everybody needs to work out. So our product is for everybody. That's just not an effective strategy. Get radically focused on your customer, understand who they are, understand what your values are, and then build a product or a service offering that is custom tailored, bespoke for them. And then more people will find that product, and you sort of iterate from there.
So I don't know if you know this, and we haven't talked about this in prep either, but I'm very much right now, even for my business, I have dived into this context of positioning. And it's interesting because if you do positioning well on the market, it's essentially what you're putting together a context for people to think about the way how they think about your product, the way how they think about your service. And that's what it's all about. You might be serving all people, but positioning yourself on the market in a specific way means that you're giving people context how they should be thinking about you. So if someone is thinking about, okay, so how do I really do this in reality? Like, how does this look like? How do I use those two things if I want to position myself as a challenger brand? What would you say to someone like that?
That's a really good question, Cathy. So I'm going to use my own company as an example here. So I'm in the advertising agency business. I've been in the business for almost 40 years, believe it or not.
And congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you. It's not an easy thing to survive, but I've done it. But one of the things that ad agencies are terrible at is positioning. We give all this advice to our clients and then we don't take it for ourselves. We want to say yes to everybody too. So if you're a franchise company, or if you're a bank, or if you're a pharmaceutical, if you're healthcare, yeah, we'll take all your business. That's who we are. That is really an effective place to play. What we did is we identified a group of clients that really cuts across a lot of industries that we define as challenger brands. And we said, okay, we're an agency that really focuses on challenger brands. Well, who are challenger brands? Well, these are the folks that they've got to outthink and not outspend the competition. They don't have an embarrassment of riches to market themselves. So that requires us to develop an entirely different ethos, entirely different sort of approach to marketing ourselves. Well, I can't tell you over the course of the years, over the last 15 years, how many prospects call me and say, my gosh, we are a challenger brand. They see themselves in what we're offering. And so we glow in the dark. And what we call that, Cathy, and this is great work from a think tank out of London called the Eat Big Fish Consultancy. And they wrote a book called Eating the Big Fish. Mm-hmm. And in that book, Adam Morgan describes what he calls a lighthouse identity. Okay, so you think about what a lighthouse is. A lighthouse is, what ships use to navigate the ocean so that they don't hit the rocks and they don't hit the shoals and all that good stuff. Well, what you're trying to do with your brand, and there's some great examples of this out there, is you're trying to create a lighthouse whereby consumers, anybody who's consuming your brand, whether you're B2B or B2C, they are navigating the category using you as a lighthouse. It's like, oh, I know who they are. And they then sort of define the context for whoever everybody else is. And so that's really what you're trying to get to as a company. It's like radical clarity on who you are and who you aren't. And that allows people to either select you or not select you, but they're really clear about your positioning. You show up with one clear, clean personality, people get you.
And if someone is trying to do this and they're going through this process and they say, okay, I understand I need to do it and I'm in the process of doing it, what would your advice be? Can they do this alone, or do they need to hire someone? Because the problem when it comes to this, as they say, it's hard to read the label from the bottle. So how much of a challenge is it if someone were to do it themselves versus, hiring someone? And who should they hire if they do hire someone to help them with that?
It certainly can be done alone. Some people have really just great marketing minds and they're able to do that. I always think it's, in our industry, we pair writers and art directors together because two heads are better than one, and they come at it from a little different direction and they crack it a little quicker. They come up with more novel solutions. So I'm a big fan of, bringing in help. Sometimes you can do that without spending money. Maybe you've got somebody in your network who's a great marketer, and maybe you can trade services and guidance, with them and sort of bounce these sorts of concepts off of them. Or, it may make sense to hire somebody. It depends on where you are, what your budget level is, and all that sort of thing. But there are a lot of great consultants out there who really do understand this stuff and I think can provide the kind of guidance. So I would say that I lean on the side of bring somebody else in to sort of test your thinking. It's tough to kind of look in the mirror all day long and sort stuff out. Again, you can get it right, but I think the old mantra, two heads are better than one, is appropriate here for sure. I will say that I didn't even come to our challenger brand positioning on my own. And this is another good way to do this. I actually got out and I was attending a conference, and I was actually up in Silicon Valley at the campus of Yahoo, and Mark Barden from Eat Big Fish was at this conference and he was talking about challenger brands. And what I noticed was every CEO in the room, there was over 100 of them, were in lean forward mode for the full 2 days. I'm like, my gosh, this has got their attention. Mm-hmm. This is a rich vein here. And so that's what prompted me to sort of bring the positioning back to the agency. And it took some convincing among my fellow leaders here at the agency that this was the right move for us. And so that's another thing too. Don't look for everybody to just jump in and go, oh my gosh, you got it. That's great. You always meet with resistance, especially the more novel and interesting and different an idea is, the more resistance you'll meet. It's a test all the way through, I think, in that respect.
And when you do that change, how long did it take for you to see the difference in the companies that you worked with? How did the market react, and how long did it take for you to see that reaction in the market?
I would say in our case, it started to immediately shape who our new business prospects were. And so I'd say within the first 6 to 12 months, that started to shift. The biggest challenge, I think, is depending on the size of your organization, is really imbuing it into the culture and getting the language to change, to getting thinking to change, to inviting new people into the organization who want to sign up for that, and parting with folks who don't. Those are difficult decisions as well. Well, I don't want to work on challenger brands. I want to work on brand A brands. I want to build my resume. That kind of stuff does come up. And so you're curating a culture around your positioning. And this is another very important point. In the book, one of the main themes is that culture drives brand. And this is my favorite definition of brand. And we hear all kinds of definitions out there. I've read them all and thought about them all and written some myself. But your brand is what people think it's like to do business with you. It's real simple.
I love that.
Your brand is if that is true, well, your culture drives your behavior. Culture drives everything about what we do, what we think, how we show up. Culture that's expressed, unexpressed. Frankly, the unexpressed rules in an organization are far more powerful than an expressed rule. It's what we do, not what we say. So that culture, and this is the brilliance of brands like Chick-fil-A, that culture needs to meet up with your brand ambitions. And so if Chick-fil-A's aspiration is to be the nicest quick service restaurant brand in the industry, and by the way, they are, and that's measurable, and to put goodness and positivity into the world, well, by gosh, their culture better reflect that. They can't then treat their employees like the typical employees treated in the QSR industry. They've got to do something to elevate. And they've done that from the inside out. And I can't overstate the importance of getting culture right, even before you start to really think about how that looks as a brand in the world. And so going back to your point about, gosh, what can small entrepreneurs do? They can really start to hone in on their culture and be really intentional about the sort of the values that they want to be operating by. It informs everything.
Yeah. So what I'm essentially hearing is you need that congruency between what you're signaling to the market and what you actually have happening in your business internally.
100%. And congruence is exactly the right word, Kathy. We write about that in our book. It's I used to tell my kids, I can't hear what you're saying. Your behavior speaks too loudly. Line those two things up. And this is really important for leaders too. And one of my messages in all the talks that I give and discussions I have around this is that, gosh, it really does all start with leadership. You can't outrun your leadership. I've got a dear friend who runs a leadership development program that I actually went through called the Stagen Leadership Academy. And he often relates is that leaders will come to him and say, hey, I need a development program for my people. I need to get my people fixed. I need to develop them with no regard whatsoever for their own development.
Yeah.
And he always laughs and he listens for that too, because it's like, no, you need to get the mask on your face before you can begin to help anybody else. You really need to work on your own development. And I think that goes to leadership development. A lot of us give ourselves a lot of credit for being great leaders because our title is CEO or president or the boss. It's just not true. If anything, that it comes with a lot of liabilities. Folks won't always be honest with you. So look in the mirror, do your own development work. And I think that'll pay dividends throughout all of this stuff.
And you bring a good point, especially in the small businesses. When you started the business, people usually started because they enjoy what they're doing and they want to offer it to clients, customers, or whatever. But running a business, it's very different from being really good at what you do, because you have to do business development, you have to do sales, you have to do, if you have people and team, now you have to figure out, how do I actually lead these people? How are they effective? I mean, there's so many other pieces in the business. And I would say, if you want professional and personal development on steroids, go start a business, because nothing will tell you your weaknesses and your strength as much as running a business well. I see that all the time with the businesses that I work with. They're growing, but they focus on, well, stuff is not really happening the way I need it to. It's like, yes, because a lot of the pieces that you need in leadership are not there right now. So you have to figure out, how do you do that? So usually what I do is I recommend a lot of leadership coaches, because obviously I'm there for finances and I'm not a leadership coach. But you do need that, because it will affect the way how ultimately everything ends up in numbers, and it will affect the financials for sure.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I think that, leadership development, one of the biggest things that it does for somebody, and I brought, this is another game changer in my organization. I went through this course probably back in 2009, and I've stayed with it all these years. It was a 1 year intensive leadership development course. Again, I thought I was a pretty good leader, but you can't see your blind spots. That's why they're called blind spots. But what it does essentially, and any good program will do this, I think, is that it elevates your sense of self-awareness. And when you elevate your awareness, now you can see more options. You have more optionality. Okay. And when you have more optionality, it leads to greater success. Okay. But the other thing that happens is that when a leader becomes aware and a leader has more choices, he also and she brings with them sort of an obligation and a responsibility to sort of pay that forward and help elevate the awareness of those around them, because you'll see things that others can't, and you've got to develop the capacity for bringing them into that in a way that honors their own development. And that's what I did in my organization too. And so I put a number of my leaders through the same program. And what it helped us do was develop a shared language, a shared understanding. It helped elevate the awareness of everybody inside the organization. It helped us bring in training across the board, improved our culture. We're now working on, I think, 10 times in a row, best places to work, Dallas Morning News, Dallas Business Journal. Yeah. And I consider that, by the way, the high water sort of benchmark for my own leadership. If we miss that list, I'm looking in the mirror. It's like, okay, what are we not doing here? What do I need to tune up? And it's not a given that you make that list every year. In fact, I think it gets a little harder. So those are just some of the things that I would say to, gosh, no matter, I don't care if you're a 2-person shop or, you've got 1,000 folks working for you. I think the organization, my friend Rand has got a statement. He said, leaders get the organization they deserve. So the organization can only develop as far as the leader develops. And it's hard work.
I hate to put you on the spot here, but what I'm really interested in too is your personal journey. What were some of the challenges that you have in your leadership development, and how did you overcome that?
There were so many, Kathy, but I'll tell you one was, and this I think is probably the truth for a lot of entrepreneurs. I was hustling hard. I worked hard. I worked sideline to sideline, probably too hard for most people. And I expected the same from those around me. I expected that very same intensity. Anything less suggested to me that they just weren't as committed, and they weren't, wow, did I have to adjust my game with respect to that? I chased off some good people, sadly. I think my own sense of compassion around that has opened up. I also recognize that, gosh, I don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. And by the way, if I am, there's a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of us as young entrepreneurs, we build our careers through personal heroics. And man, we get a buzz when people need us, and we get a buzz when we're the ones with the right answer. That was me, certainly through my 30s and maybe chased me into my 40s. But making the turn and recognizing, no, wait a minute, there's folks who have greater capacities for these things than I do. Let me help them develop them. My partner, Julie, is a great example of this. We've worked together for 22 years. When I came into the organization, I was president. She was a young account person. She didn't have all the training that she needed, but God, she had all the raw materials. Well, she has so outstripped me and outkicked me from her ability to lead clients and run this organization. My ego would have been so in front of that and would have tamped that growth down. And I think maybe I did early on.
Mm-hmm.
But once I got out of the way and allowed her to blossom and invested as much in her development, it's just, she flourished. And I can't imagine where we'd be without her capacity as a leader. We wouldn't be halfway where we are right now. And she's one example. There are many other folks inside the organization. It's about, I think, recognizing your blind spots, getting out of the way, doing what you do best, and sort of relaxing into it. It takes some practice. It really does.
I like to think of that in a way of, it's not about you, even if you started the company, but company, in my head, the way how I think about companies is they have their own, they're almost like their own person.
Yeah.
So how do you take care of this? If we think that company is its own person, how do we take care of it in the best way possible? And a lot of times, even though you started it, you might not be the best person to take care of it 100%. Obviously, no one can be good at everything. So thinking about it, not what's good for you personally, even sometimes you get into your own ego, as you said, but what is good for the company, and how can you strategically put people in the right places, in the right seats, so that the company thrives. And obviously, if you're the owner, if the company thrives, then you're thriving by default, by definition of it, right?
Yeah. Well, Kathy, first of all, I think that's exactly the right way to think about a company, as a living organism, just like a person. I mean, that's essentially what the culture is. It's shaped, by people. It's changing with every person who leaves, every person who goes. And I think really, and this might sound a little hippie and out there with folks, but gosh, it starts with love. It starts with loving the company, loving the people, really developing a genuine interest in their development. It's sort of giving first and getting second, really developing that orientation, developing an orientation around trying to help people transform and grow, and not making things just transactional. Again, it sounds a little esoteric, but you have to, I think, treat your company the way you would treat someone you love, and try to help it flourish in every way that you possibly can. And if you do that, what you find is that all of a sudden you'll be surrounded by co-conspirators, people who are trying to help you create something that's really good in the world, because it's good for them too. Everybody wants an answer to the question, what's in it for me? Whether they state that explicitly or not, when people understand that you are really for them and you're trying to help build them, it pays huge dividends. One quick example is that in most organizations, if you want to leave, that's the last thing you tell your boss. That's the last thing you talk about. When you're interviewing, you got to sneak around and pretend you have dentist appointments, and you got to, all this kind of nonsense. We tell people, and we mean it, if they want to leave, we'll help them. I'm very proud of the careers that our alumni have gone on to build. I mean, it's some really great agencies and great companies. I mean, that makes me really proud. I don't want anybody to stay here beyond sort of their term limit, if you will. If people want to move on, I want to help them with that. And when you collaborate and cooperate in that way, it's amazing what shows up. I mean, we've had people return as clients. We've had people return as employees again. We've had clients return because we take that same orientation toward our client relationships. A lot of agencies, man, when a client says they're done, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to pitch the keys on the roof and walk away. That's your problem. And we're not that way. I mean, if you're really trying to operate, if you're trying to put some good into the world and do the right things, you have to hold that orientation, even when it's most challenging, and perhaps when it's especially most challenging. We've had clients leave. We thought the circumstances were really unfair. And still, you show up in a way that you're trying to put good energy into that, even that leaving transaction, and it ultimately pays dividends. What we follow basically are the tenets of conscious capitalism. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the whole conscious capitalism movement, but it's fantastic stuff, and the results speak for themselves. A book you'd probably be interested in, Kathy, if you haven't read it, is Firms of Endearment by Raj Sisodia. He's a financial guy, I think, and he made a really compelling case for companies that operate by the four tenets of conscious capitalism, and I won't recall them all. But the outsized financial returns of these companies as compared to their peer sets, it's unreal. And the thing that sits in the middle of all that is the stakeholder orientation, as opposed to a shareholder extractive sort of everything done in service of shareholders, everything else be damned. The stakeholder orientation, it's not sort of a win-lose construct. It's really a win-win-win. So your employees would be a stakeholder, your clients obviously a stakeholder, your customers, your vendor partners. I hate the word vendor, but that's the nomenclature, but your vendor partners, your community. When you're really trying to balance the equation so that all of them benefit for what your enterprise is putting into the world, I mean, magic happens in that place. And the book Firms of Endearment does just a masterful job of laying that out. And so we try to operate along those lines. And it's not always easy. It's a lot easier and expedient sometimes to do the easy thing. But we really try to hold ourselves to that standard.
Thank you for suggesting that book. I'll definitely check it out, and I'll also put it in the show notes if anyone else is interested in this as well. And I 100% agree with you, because I come from the corporate world, and how many times I have seen made financial, operational, and any other decisions in a penny wise and pound foolish way, as we talked about at the beginning, because they're so concerned about the next quarter, about how the stock market's going to react, and we need to get our stock up. And I always say, the easiest way to show a lot of profit on your profit and loss statement is you just slash costs. You just start firing people, you slash your marketing, you slash all of these things. It will look great. It will absolutely look great for maybe 3 to 6 months, but you reap what you sow. And 6 months to a year later, you will have some tremendous problems. So having that short-term view, it's not doing anyone any favors, and not even the stock market, for goodness sakes.
No, it's really true. And obviously there's some real flaws with that whole model and that construct. I think it's something that does need to be cured. And at some point, maybe it will be. For me personally, that's one of the reasons I've always been attracted to smaller sort of private concerns. You have more control. You don't have to deal with a lot of the stuff that comes along with the big corporations. There's plenty of goodness there too. It's just, what do you want to sign up for? And how hard do you want to be wrestling with the challenges that come along with that? In my case, not much. I just don't have much capacity for that. But in a smaller concern, I think this is what's great about being, an entrepreneur is, gosh, the course is yours to chart. And so, but be deliberate, think intentionally about, okay, what is it that I want to create? And if the results aren't there immediately, that is the great thing with sort of a long-term perspective. If you believe in it, you can take a 3, 5, 10-year perspective. The group that I'm involved with, the Stegan leadership community, Rand, he's got companies in there that have, crazy enough, that they got 25 and 50-year horizons, and some even longer than that. Some generational companies in that. Thinking of one of my former clients and friends at First United Bank, gosh, they're on sort of a 100-year trajectory, which is just kind of overwhelming to think about. And then you might look at that and say, from a planning perspective, well, that's silly. So much is going to change. How can we possibly know? And yet, values don't have to change, and the mission doesn't have to change. And certainly we can adjust to circumstances. But if you understand who you are, it's a lot easier to navigate those difficulties than it is if you're trying to figure it out on the way and always retrading that. It becomes real challenging. And the other thing is, from a leadership standpoint, it's really attractive to know who you are. People really are attracted to companies, brands, people who have a clear sense of who they are. Not to be conflated with ego, but just a real clear understanding of who they are and what they do and how they're trying to operate in the world. That's attractive.
And I always like to bring this back into very concrete examples. Do you have an example of a small business that started with, we are for everyone, our customer is everyone, and they evolved into this challenger brand, and now they're thriving? Do you have an example of that?
Well, one that's fresh on my head, just because my buddy is working with us to kind of help him make the turn on it. My friend Brian Wing actually is the guy who runs this company, and he bought a small CPA firm called LJB, a CPA firm for everybody and anybody. And Brian is working on, and has been since he took the firm over 2 years ago, on making a transition to where he really just wants to deal with companies and businesses that are trying to put good into the world. Again, coming back to this whole conscious capitalism orientation, his expressed purpose is to essentially elevate humanity through good accounting practices, if you will. And it's not just about accounting. Well, in the last year, and by the way, through all of the pandemic, I mean, Brian's heart, I mean, he's got a huge heart. He's a numbers guy. You'd appreciate that for sure. He's got a great head for numbers, obviously, but he's got a great heart and a great love for just helping businesses thrive and survive. And so through the entire pandemic, I mean, his business over the last year has doubled just by getting radically clear on the kinds of companies that he wants to work for and very clear on the kind of companies that de-energize him and de-energize his team. And that's really important too, from a cultural standpoint, is thinking about who you want to invite into your organization, especially if you're a service provider. Your clients have everything to do with your culture. There's a book, it's sort of I guess it's called No Assholes or something like that. And, and the whole premise of the book is being really deliberate about who you want to offer your services to and how you want to shape your organization. Brian has done a great job of that. And he's currently in the process of actually renaming the firm and remessaging the firm. And I predict great things from him. So that'll be a company to kind of keep your eye on, over the course of time here. And there's many others like that, Kathy. I'm sure I could pull a bunch of other examples if we had the time.
This is really interesting. Even when I think about your agency, when you went out there and you said, we want to work with challenger brands, and then with Brian that he wanted to do business with those particular customers. But you could say, well, if I'm doing prospecting, let's say, right? Because I just started doing that and marketing is going to take a while to take root and for people to understand that. But if I'm doing prospecting, it's hard to go and there's no filter that says, are you a challenger brand? Are you, what type of company we're looking at from the ethos perspective? Like, how would you manage that from the beginning when you need to get the business that you want to get, but the positioning is not as established just yet on the market?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kathy. So we're talking about marketing funnel stuff. Now we're at the top of the marketing funnel, and we are casting a wide net because we're trying to expose our services to everybody in service of finding the right customers as well. Now, a couple of things here. When I first started with this agency, and it was just this little fledgling shop, and we didn't have many clients, we did indeed take on business that paid the bills and kept the lights on, and we understood what the role for that client was. And it involved a compromise very often. Like early on, we had some clients that, man, I didn't love the category. I really didn't love the clients personally and the way they were oriented, but it was serving a purpose and it was helping us move along the trail. So I'm not suggesting turn down anything that doesn't absolutely fit your mold, unless you have the wherewithal to do that. But once you start moving in the right direction and you've achieved some stability and you have the luxury of saying no to clients and saying no to opportunities, which is really important to understand your no's, then you need to start doing that. And so what we'll do is we get all kinds of inquiries through our website, through our network, and just by virtue of our reputation. And that's great. But our very first act is to put together a discovery call. And in that call, we learn everything we need to know about whether or not that client would be a good fit for us or not. And when they're not a good fit for any number of reasons, maybe it's a category my team isn't particularly interested in. Maybe there's a personality that, we're getting a read here that's going to be good. And we all know that. Or any number of things. What we'll do is we'll make a referral, to somebody else. We want to help them along. It's not like, no, go away. We definitely want to help them along, but we are quick to recognize when the opportunity is not going to honor what we're trying to do in the world. And we make that hard call. Earlier in my career, that was much more difficult for me to do. Yep. As I got clear on my own values and the kind of day that I wanted to have and the kind of day that I wanted my team to have, it became easier to do. And it is such an empowering place to be able to say yes and to be able to say no with all the respect in the world, but to be very clear about who you want to give your services to. You work really hard. You have something to offer, and just make sure that the folks on the receiving end are worthy of that. That's all.
I'm in a position now that I could do the same in my business as well. And it still hurts to say no to business.
Yeah.
It does. But if you're looking at it from a perspective of conscious capitalism, it's like, what is going to serve the client the best?
Yeah.
So you're putting your needs behind the client. So the client's needs are always in the front for it. And the best way to serve the client could be that they just have to work with someone else.
Yeah, 100%, Kathy. And again, too, if you're taking business that doesn't align with your values, it's not congruent with your culture and all that sort of thing, your team members know that. And so a lot of times I think leaders will say, well, we'll get through it. We'll just give it to this team and they'll just do it. But you lose all kinds of credibility, in that. And then you can't stand up and say, well, hey, we've got these values and we live to these values. And, it just doesn't work. It's, again, incongruent. It's like, I can't hear what you're saying because your behavior speaks too loudly. And then things start to crumble. So again, it's none of this is easy. It involves hard decisions. And I hate saying no to revenue too. We had a client prospect, this goes back probably 4 or 5 years ago. They were desperate for us to take their business, which is kind of crazy. It literally would have doubled our revenue. And the reason they were desperate is, frankly, the reason we ultimately turned them down. And I won't get into who it is or even the category because I don't want to start anything. But I was really proud of the decision, and it also hurt. I went home for a week. I was like, oh my God, what we could have done with that revenue and how that would have really helped the organization thrive. And we can think of all the good things, but ultimately it was absolutely the right decision. And I'm glad we made it. And we've made many like that.
Yeah. Otherwise, you would have been in a position of trading values for money.
And by the way, I know I would have lost people too, people that I really think a whole lot of. And while this isn't a democracy, it kind of is, at least the way I run things. I really want the thoughts and opinions of my folks. And whether I follow them or not, at least they know that I value them. And I do. And I want to hear about them. To simply do it the way you want to do it with no regard for anybody else, it just is not a good long-term plan at all.
So, Mike, this has been an absolute fantastic conversation. I love all the paths that we took with this. So if someone is listening to this and says, okay, I understand what the challenger brand is. I understand the positioning. I understand the values that I need in the business. There's a lot of stuff happening here, right?
Yeah.
Where can I start? What can I do in the next week or two? If I want to go down this path of a challenger brand, what can I do? Something tangible.
Well, the first thing I would say, Kathy, is to get really clear on your values. What is it that is important to you? And then from that, if you don't have a mission statement, by gosh, commit it to writing. There's so much power in that. I mean, sit down and actually write out a mission statement. Here's what we're doing in the world. And then create a vision statement. I mean, these are really simple things. A vision statement. Okay, who do we want to become? Who do we aspire to? It doesn't mean that you won't ever amend that, but put something down in writing. And if you've got some peers in your business that are important, and they're all important, I think, in these sorts of discussions, invite them into that discussion. I think that's a really smart, tangible thing that you can go and do. And you might say, yeah, but that's not going to win me an account today, or that's not going to get me a new customer today. Believe me, you're putting things in motion. You're putting forces in motion that you don't even fully understand. Even if you don't come back to that for 6 months or a year, you're starting to do the work. So I would say that, number one. Number two, I would say invest in your own leadership. All of this sort of cascades out of that. Invest something in your own leadership, whether it's just reading some good books on the topic or actually enrolling in a leadership development program, which I could not recommend more. Do that.
Mike, where can people find you?
Well, they can find me on my website at theloomisagency.com. That's THELOOMIS agency.com. By the way, we could have gotten that URL. When we got that URL all those years ago, we could have gotten TLA, but we thought spelling out our whole name was a good idea. Anyway, you can get me there. Any of the contact buttons will come straight to me and some other folks in the organization. And certainly if you want to see the book, if you want to read the book, that's on Amazon, Voice of the Underdog, How Challenger Brands Create Distinction by Thinking Culture First.
Awesome, Mike. Thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy.
Well, thanks so much for joining me on this episode today. And I hope that you picked up some great tips on how your culture and using the challenger brand strategy help you stand out in a crowded market. Also, if you love this episode, you can find all the timestamps, show notes, blog posts, and links on my website, newcastlefinance.us/podcast. And before I go, as always, I do have a favor to ask. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcast, if you could please go to the show and tap the number of stars that you think the show deserves, because this gives us that much needed Apple algorithm love, and it helps other people find it and benefit from it as well. Thanks so much. Until next time.